Good morning. This is being recorded on November 25. The world is full of messes, but I will confine myself to the Ukraine for today. So a few preliminary things about Ukraine, right? Ukraine is not some pipsqueak country. Ukraine has a population of about 37, 38 million people. And we may recall or not that Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power until the end of the Cold War, when President Clinton negotiated with the Ukraine, and the nuclear capacity was destroyed in the Ukraine, and the uranium was sent to Russia, so that Ukraine is not a nuclear competent country, which of course Russia is, and Russia is threatening to use nuclear weapons. So this just by way of background. The second comment about background is that amongst all the other missiles and upgrades in capacity and so forth, which I'll talk about in a minute, one of the kind of weapons, quite aside from all these, fancy missiles and so forth, are landmines. And landmines are relevant if and when there is some kind of cessation of the conflict. But since that may happen sooner or later, meaning probably after Trump comes into power, it's worthwhile talking about. Landmines are laid so that the enemy can be blown up, and both sides have used landmines. And what's interesting about landmines, let me just give you a little background. Landmines have been incredibly destructive to civilian populations historically, including colonial places like Mozambique, and if any of you have gone to Southeast Asia, let's say in the 90s or thereafter, you can see all kinds of young people, teenagers and so forth, with arms and legs blown off. And that happened while they were working on the farm or going somewhere, and they were just blown up. That was not necessarily happening during the war at all. It's just that the residue of landmines lasts a very long time unless successful demining can take place. And it's very destructive of the civilian population. And demining is both complex and not always successful. They're still finding every 2 or 3 years a landmine from World War II somewhere in Poland and so forth. But here's the thing. In 1997, because of all the civilian harm in various parts of the world, a landmine treaty arose and was confirmed by, I think it was something like 164 countries, maybe, out of 200. And neither the Soviet Union, then Russia, or the United States are signatories to the landmine treaty. The reason they didn't want to sign, for the U.S. argument was, through several administration, that it needed to have landmines in case of a North-South Korean conflict. And that was the American excuse. There were other excuses by other countries. And part of the landmine treaty was not only that you couldn't plant them, but you couldn't sell them to other countries. And it is not total. Russia has its own landmines. It's not exactly clear where the Ukrainian landmines come from. You're saying, well, this is not an issue this week or next week, but I just want to raise it because, quite aside from the destruction that is currently taking place everywhere, there are going to be overhang discussions, even if there's some kind of peace treaty. Now, the situation in Ukraine right now is really very dire. I mean, close to 1 million people have been killed. The military in the Ukraine is essentially made up of middle-aged soldiers who have just stuck with it through thick and thin, and increasingly young recruits that have been forced by Ukraine who are ill trained. And in the case of Russia, you have the Russian military. They have had huge losses, and they have now been augmented by soldiers from North Korea. So both militaries have suffered seriously and are now augmented by people of questionable skill and background. And what that means is not so much that they can't successfully move into various fronts, but it does mean a very huge toll, because by being inexperienced, among other things, soldiers tend to get themselves killed. So Ukraine at the moment is up between a rock and a hard place. The destruction that Russia is visiting in all areas of Ukraine right now is because it wants to make a point of its power, strength, and capacity to do Ukraine in before there are any kind of peace negotiations. Ukraine, on the other side, is trying to keep things going and, pleading with the United States and NATO to give it its military requirements to continue to stand up and not lose more territory. I think all observers of the U.S. policy with providing arms for Ukraine more or less agree that almost all Ukraine's pleading for more arms, or particular arms, in this particular case, long-range missiles and so forth, when they have been given, when they have arrived, has always been too late. That is to say, not in a timely fashion for Ukraine to hold its own in a territory or prevent further incursions in the Ukraine. So while the Ukrainians are putting on a brave face, and the government is putting on a brave face, Ukraine is actually in a lot of difficulty. Domestic difficulty, more and more civilians getting killed in apartment houses, not just at the front, but in every imaginable city. And of course, Putin saber rattling and essentially saying, if Ukraine is provided with a kind of long range capacity and it's going to use it inside Russian territory, guess what? We might use nuclear weapons. Now, I actually, I don't have inside knowledge. I actually think that that's not about to happen at the moment. It's just saber rattling. And in the meantime, two things are happening outside this conflict. One, Europe is also, and NATO is also getting very sick and tired of this conflict. Most European countries have economic difficulties and therefore are unlikely to want to up the ante to provide more weapons and spend more on defense. On the other hand, NATO is trying to hang on, and because they will be threatened once Trump gets into power, right? He doesn't approve of NATO. So NATO is nervous, and NATO is trying to up its capacity to show strength. The U.S. Outgoing Biden government is quickly trying to give some of what Ukraine has been asking for some time before Trump comes into power. And everybody is more or less pretty clear that when Trump comes into power, he and Putin will push for some kind of peace deal, some kind of peace agreement. So that the general kind of depressing attitude at the moment is that Ukraine can't really win this. And it probably can't hold on to the territory that the Russians have taken over. The best it can do in the next month or so is to try to prevent more territory being taken over. And in the meantime, we have winter in that part of the world. which means, of course, people are cold, and they're especially cold because one of the targets of destruction by the Russians at the moment are all the various electronic and heating facility all over Ukraine. So even though Ukraine has shown huge capacity to quickly fix these installations and restore heat and electricity, there's no way that they can quickly do the amount of damage that Russians have visited upon these installations in the Ukraine during the last few weeks. So, if you were Ukrainian, if you might try to put on a good face, but the situation really looks quite dire. And of course, quite dire because Trump is no particular interest in helping Ukraine in this situation. And it has very much interest to show that he can make changes, as he keeps saying, on day one. That is, say, he and Putin will get together and force some kind of peace deal onto Ukraine. I think best case scenario for Ukraine is not to regain the 18% or so of the territory that it has lost during this conflict at this point. But at this particular point, a holding operation, trying to find some neutral, maybe a neutral cordon of some cut or another, is probably what everybody will be pushing for. The Russians might agree to that, and if it's a small corridor, and the Europeans and NATO and the United States will all be pushing for it because everybody wants a stop to this. For Ukraine, this is sort of a tragedy, right? But on the other hand, I think everybody agrees. By everybody, I mean the United States and Europe, and for that matter, even Russia, is that Ukraine can't win. And I mean, win this, namely, get all the territory back. And whether some kind of peace treaty can be developed that will allow some modicum of a reduction of conflict and a rebuilding of Ukraine, and that might last for some years, and then there might be another conflict, is, I think, what people are aiming for. Which, if you're Ukrainian, is quite sad. In the meantime, of course, Ukraine as a country is in some serious disarray. I mean, the fact that the situation of the war is so dire and so complex has given the current Ukrainian administration a black eye in the eyes of the Ukrainian population. They're sort of saying, well, we're sick of this government, they have not protected us, the war continues, and so forth. So the current Ukrainian government may in fact either fail and go out of power, or at least fail in the sense of not enjoying the support that it had by the population. And of course, the population of Ukraine has also thinned out because 1 million, 2 million Ukrainians have left. Many of them may not want to go back, will stay in Poland. Many of the women and children who have left, hundreds of thousands, in fact, have lost their husbands in any event. So the disarray, the sociological disarray of the Ukrainian population and Ukrainians is really considerable. And it has been, in some senses, more costly than it has been to Russia and Putin. In the case of Russia, lots of people have lost their sons, but it really hasn't shaken Russian society the way that one can assume, and has some evidence for that it's shaken Ukrainian society. But of course, quite outside of Russia and Ukraine and Trump coming in and Putin, there is the ongoing European dimension. Because one of the things that Putin has said is that he intends to want to reclaim other Ukrainian territory, never mind the Ukraine, for example, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And those little countries, and in contrast to Trump's attacks, they in fact have spent 2% of their little economies on military, on defense, and so forth. But they have no way, unless NATO really comes to their rescue, to survive a Russian attack and invasion. And that always seemed very unlikely because the idea was the United States, of course, would then get involved to protect those countries. Well, Trump, you may recall, is on record of having said to Putin when he says, well, I really want those places back. And he said, go right ahead, help yourself. We're not going to get involved. In other words, Trump is on the record of saying to Russia, never mind Ukraine for a minute, after Ukraine, feel free to go into the Baltic states. If that is the case, it's, a recipe for another world war, right? Because NATO will have to step up. And even if Trump is, reticent, the United States will probably get involved. And you can say, well, what I'm telling you all is sort of scary stuff, worst case scenarios. But we have to think of the worst case scenarios here, because there is Trump is on Putin's side in this. Let him get his territories back that he lost in the Second World War. He is, America first, so why not Russia first? And so there is a weakened United States in this terrain of protecting any other incursions on the part of Russia. And there is NATO trying to stay strong and trying to get the support of its member states. But many of the member states are in difficulty. They're in political difficulty. I mean, look, the German government is falling apart. Macron is more or less a lame duck at this point in some ways, and the French politics are in disarray. Several other European countries have elected right-wing governments, which might say, we really don't want to spend treasure and humans, in fighting Russia getting its places back. Now, I'm exaggerating. Nobody has really said we won't step up if Russia tries to increase its territory again. But it is not an unlikely scenario. So here we are talking about, on the one hand, the outcome of Ukraine. On the other hand, we're talking about a very nervous Europe, nervous internally in terms of its own politics, but also nervous in terms of what the Russians may do. And we're talking about a NATO which is trying very hard to make sure that it has the means and the resources with which to deter in the first instance. And if it can't deter, stop Russia incursion in the next few years. And of course, NATO's strength, while it has considerable strength, is in part also dependent on the US. That is to say, the US is the largest contributor, and even if everybody steps up to 2%, it's still the largest contributor. Much of the hardware that NATO has is stored in Europe, in places like Italy, so that it can quickly be activated and doesn't have to come to the United States. But it's U.S. role in the future of Europe, where Trump has said repeatedly he's not really concerned about Europe. America first, high tariffs, on anything coming from the outside world. We're going to have, repatriate all industries. We don't really care. Let the Europeans, let the Asians, let everybody look out for themselves. We're going to be America first. And of course, half the American population who voted for Trump either is and was ignorant of the international dimensions of all of this, or possible international dimensions of all of this, or if they were, are on Trump's side. And here the interesting fact is that some of his appointments are also, of course, supporters of Trump's ideas on this. Oddly, of course, there are people in Congress, including Republicans in the Senate, who have been very supportive of the U.S. helping the Ukraine, and might, actually in due course find some differences in terms of foreign policy uh, with Trump, but that is basically to be seen. So here we are. It's Christmas, holiday seasons. We're all going to eat our turkeys. We're not really impacted directly, but we're facing a very dire international situation, both in terms of Ukraine, in terms of Europe, and other places in the world that I'm not going to talk about today. And if you were Ukrainian right now, I think you would be quite freaked out in terms of what is happening. You would be freaked out in terms of what has happened over the years of the war, but you'd be even more freaked out about the very quick and paced damage that Russia is visiting upon Ukraine right now, between now and when Trump comes into power, making it sure that it is bringing Ukraine to its feet, or to its knees, I guess that's the right terminology, to its knees, so that the government in Ukraine and Ukrainians are really saying, okay, we have to give up all of this and we can't reclaim all of our territory, but this has to stop. We have no heat, it's freezing cold, our cities are destroyed, civilians are being killed right and left, and so forth. So we're at a kind of a crucial point, and we're in a very dangerous point right now. Dangerous in terms of what's going to happen between now and Trump's inauguration, and of course dangerous in terms of the inauguration of Trump and what will happen in terms of the administration that comes into power. I really, really want to emphasize that it is really easy for us to say at this point, come on, we've got enough problems. The whole Ukraine, Russian, European stuff really isn't and shouldn't be a priority. But as I have indicated in a previous talk, the balance of power in the world has been and is being realigned, and the American century is over. And what is happening in Ukraine, what might happen in terms of some kind of permanent or temporary, if it's temporary, it'll reignite itself, and if it looks permanent, it'll probably also reignite peace in the Ukraine. And the role or lack of role or change of role, and the missteps of not providing Ukraine what it needed, when it needed it, and so forth. All of these chickens are coming home to roost, not just in the outcome of Ukraine, which I talked about today, and the role of and the fears of the EU and NATO, but is really some kind of nails in the coffin of America being seen by others, whether it's in Europe or in Asia or anywhere else, as the US is no longer willing to, down the road, maybe capable of playing the role that we all needed it to play since the end of the Second World War. So, in some senses, whatever is going out there in terms of Ukraine has far wider implications than Ukraine. And the implications are both in what's happening in Europe right now and Russia and Ukraine, but also what's happening in terms of the pronouncements of the Trump administration. And I think we all better get used to the fact that there will be a new world disorder, and that the US is not any longer the essential power in the world, as seen not just by other governments, but also by citizens. Whether one thinks this is a good thing or a bad thing depends on your point of view. But Ukraine is not a thing unto itself sitting out there. It is a thing, as well as the results of the American election, which in a very serious place has changed the role we play in the world. And this may have both serious and all kinds of unexpected consequences for US and world affairs, which we can't all predict, but which we should keep an eye on. In the meantime, we all have to do the best we can and try to have a okay Thanksgiving. I'll see you again in 2 weeks.